and is the head of the research library. Anyone who knows the gallery knows that if you've got a question, you go to Stephen. He's a wealth of information. And as we've discussed this morning, one of the issues really for the art gallery is the line of descendancy from the from the Garden Palace to the Art Gallery of New South Wales. But like all family trees, I think they often need some explaining, and so hopefully you might be able to shed some light on this descendancy. Thanks, Stephen.
Good morning, everyone. I'll try to keep it fast so that you get a bit of lunch. My focus today is very much on the 1879 exhibition as an opportunity for the fledgling Art Gallery of New South Wales. And as you can see, I've titled my presentation Political Performance, Competing Agendas at the 1879 International Exhibition, because the general theme of our seminar today is spectacle, manifestation and performance. And I think very much the Sydney International Exhibition in 1879 was an opportunity where our trustees played a very astute political game to realise some particular long-held agendas, namely a permanent house, a permanent home for the building, and a broadening out of the collection. Which one? This is a new... as an institution in 1879, the gallery was merely 8 years old. As you can see from this document, it grew organically out of the New South Wales Academy of Art, which was established in 1871. So as Michael, our director, mentioned, in 2021 it will be the 150th anniversary of the establishment of the gallery. The Academy was founded in 1871, initiated in 1871, largely by E.L. Montefiore, Eccleston Dufour, and another person who's not shown here, Ed Arthur Reeve from Sydney University. It was initially established to enrich the cultural life of the colony, mainly by holding colonial exhibitions of contemporary art, and by organising those quasi-social events, smokos and conversazioni, which were so loved by the Victorians. It was supported from the second year, from 1872, by the government to hold these exhibitions. And in 1874, the government voted a grant of money so that this Academy of Art could purchase artworks. And in 1876, a body of trustees were founded to manage the purchases of these works of art for the colony, for the people of New South Wales. You can see here Sir Alfred Stephen was the first president, and Montefiore, who became our first director, and Dufour, who became our most active president, were among that first group of trustees in 1876. Today in the gallery, we very much celebrate the fact that we have two artists on our board of trustees. Back at this time, a real priority for the gallery was to have members of the board who were sitting either in the upper or the lower house of Parliament. And they very astutely appointed Alfred Stephen as the president, a man with really fine connections within government and the judiciary, and a man used to getting his own way. In 1875, as I said, in 1874 there was the first grant of money, but we didn't have a permanent home, so we had a collection without a building. In 1875, the trustees rented temporary premises, which Michael has mentioned, at number 6 Elizabeth Street. In that, you can see the building in the middle there. I can't see. J. Clark, Professor of Dancing, a fine two-storey Georgian building that no longer exists. The ground floor was used for lessons in dancing and concerts. The trustees rented the top floor and opened it up to the public on Wednesdays and Saturday afternoons. They also held art classes there. They employed Giulio Anaviti, an Italian artist, as art teacher. There was, as mentioned this morning, this competition with Melbourne. Melbourne had established its gallery in 1861, and it also had an art school associated with the gallery. So there was the same vision for the Art Gallery of New South Wales. This building, as you can see from the illustration below, was not ideal in many ways. It was too small. There were problems of access and security. And in fact, when the gallery purchased Ford Madox Brown's large painting, Chaucer at the Court of Edward III, which was the first major acquisition of a European oil in 1876, the painting was too large to take up the stairs to be put on display. So from 1876 to 1879, that key work from the collection was held at the Australian Museum. So you can see that it was not an ideal situation. In 1878, the building actually came onto the market, and so there was a period of insecurity for the trustees. They approached the government and they asked the government whether they could purchase the entire building, because this would resolve part of their problems. They'd have the lower part, the lower rooms, as well as the up story. I think it's interesting that they didn't ask the government for a complete gift of money. They asked the governments for partial funds and then for a loan for other funds, which they said that they could repay back, because the acoustics of the lower hall in this building were particularly fine, and it was used for concerts, Sydney at that time not having a dedicated space for performances of classical music. So they were sure that by renting that space for commercial usages, they could pay back the loan to the government, which I think is very interesting in light of recent debates about a gallery using some spaces for commercial purposes, in light of silly comments made by a former Prime Minister. Back in 1874, there were the same pressing issues and same imaginative ways of securing the future of the gallery. As these negotiations were going on, the 1879 exhibition came up, of course. Initially, the trustees were enthusiastic about being included in the main garden palace, but very quickly their enthusiasm waned. And I don't think it's entirely cynical to say that they saw here an opportunity really to further their own particular agendas. Early in the 1879, the negotiations to buy the building in Elizabeth Street had fallen through, so there was a problem there. The Royal Society of New South Wales purchased that building, so the trustees were again tenants in this unsatisfactory building, and they were also having troubles with Signor Anaviti, who wanted to be employed as a full-time art teacher and wanted dedicated spaces for students. So they were eager to extract themselves out of that situation and find a solution. So at the 11th hour, the trustees inspected the space allocated to them in the building, and they decided it was not appropriate, and they threatened to pull out. There's a number of letters in the archive that explain the reasons for this, and you can see basically in this letter, their final letter to the governor, they complained about the deficiency of light, about the paucity of space dedicated to the collection, conservation issues, genuine concerns about the large passage of people, and I think very interestingly at the end, for us knowing the history, they argued that a separate building would be prudent. Such separation would further distribute the risk of loss by fire, which of course proved completely the case. The government agreed to these arguments, and they voted a sum of £5,000 for the construction of a separate building, which became known as the Fine Arts Annexe. It was built according to the press, not according to our records, not by Barnett, but by William Wardell, who of course was the architect that built St Mary's Cathedral and St Pat's Cathedral in Melbourne. You can see it This is a black and white of the watercolour that we've already seen. You can see it at the top there, that building of a three-tiered roof. This will give you, this is a photograph of the facade of the central court. You can see an entirely different building to the Garden Palace, a building almost on a domestic scale with a facade not unlike facades of commercial buildings in the city at that time. It had a large central hall and then two galleries off the side. In that etching from the Sydney Illustrated News, you get a much clearer idea of the building. So the central court there with the entrance and the two flanking central galleries. It's interesting, this was put up very quickly, and the trustees initially said to finance it they could charge an entrance fee during the period of the international exhibition, but that didn't occur. The government paid the entire cost for the building. The large central court was lit by natural light, as you can see from the skylights. That's an impression of the interior by Alfred Tischbauer, a colonial artist, and you can see the skylights lighting this central court. Each of these three galleries were divided into three separate rooms. This was by far the most important space in the gallery, and at the back of that space you can see on the back wall the Ford Madox Brown painting of Chaucer at the court of Edward III, which was reintegrated into the collection when the collection was moved to this building from the Australian Museum, as I've said. The side galleries were lit by artificial light, the wonder of artificial lighting. We didn't have artificial light in this building here until after the Second World War, so it's quite interesting. But in the Fine Arts Annexe, they did have it, because a part of, as the last speaker has mentioned, a part of these great international exhibitions was as a platform for advancement in arts and industry and manufacturing. And so this was an opportunity to show off these things. As you know, or a great part of the international exhibitions were the awards at the end of the exhibitions. In many ways, they were like the Olympics of arts and manufacturing. And I thought you might like to know the final tally for the Sydney International Exhibition, because Australians like a competition, and I'm aware of the Archeon at the moment. New South Wales, of course, was top of the tally board with 2,510 medals, only to be followed by Great Britain with 1,308 medals. Next came Germany with 599, France with 451, and I'm very glad to say, as a Sydney-sider, Victoria in fifth place with 409. These are various views of those side galleries. As you can see, they're pretty rough, pretty basic. The walls were hung with hessian, and the only decorative features were these fairly stylised waratahs on the walls, and the collection tightly hung. The entire collection of the gallery was on display at this time, which included not only original works but reproductions, because the gallery was buying both oil reproductions, graphic reproductions, and cast and copies, particularly for the purpose of art education. It was not ideal by any means, even though you could see it's been tarted up here. It was a wooden structure. From within the first 6 months, there were problems of termites, and of course, there was the problem of fire damage. Nonetheless, when the international exhibition closed, the governor came to this building and declared it the Art Gallery of New South Wales. And that was on the 22nd of September 1880, and you can see here an illuminated version of his address on that occasion, which we still have in our collection. So it is no longer the Fine Arts Annexe, it is officially from 1880 the Art Gallery of New South Wales. But as I said, further attempts to soften it with curtains and drapes, but really not an ideal building, even though the first dedicated building. And of course, when the Garden Palace burnt down in 1882, the trustees had even greater support for their arguments for a new building. There was a lot of confusions about what perished in that fire, and quite a number of artists thought that our collections, and still today people think a lot of our early collections perished in that fire. They didn't, in fact. They're often getting confused with the Art Society of New South Wales, who was holding exhibitions in that space, and where a number of artworks from the Art Society of New South Wales went up in fire. Our collections were separate and safe for the time. This is from Ford Madox Brown, in fact, who read of the news in London and wrote a letter saying how devastated he was that his painting had been destroyed. And you can see, he says, this picture took the better part of 5 years of my early manhood. He goes on to lament, but he ends, I would undertake to reproduce the destroyed painting identical in size and composition for 1,200 guineas. But he didn't need to do it because it was safe. The trustees went to the Parliament, so they've used the International Exhibition as an opportunity to get their first purpose-built building. They now use the fire as an opportunity to move and get a more appropriate building. The debate initially was, where should it be? And as you can see, the present gallery is marked down there. These were their preferences, which I think are very interesting. Their first preference was to pull down the Greenway building. Their first preference was opposite St Mary's Cathedral, where the swimming pool is now, on an axis with Town Hall, opposite the Australian Museum. Barnett had various plans for that site as a big building like in Melbourne with a museum, library and gallery. Their second preference was to pull down Greenway's building and build a gallery at the entrance to Macquarie Street. Where we are in the domain was number 3. This was still considered peripheral to the gallery, and the trustees thought that if the gallery was located in a more prestigious part of the city, the way it's located would be the way it's viewed and possibly the way it's funded. Today we love the present site, even though it has a lot of problems. It was not the ideal site for the trustees, and one of the big problems, and I'm sorry, I just couldn't resist putting this up, was that it was a rude site. And in lots of the correspondence, the trustees say gentlefolk will not venture into this area after 3 o'clock. The outer domain was a site notorious for prostitution and illicit liaisons, with the Navy being very close. In 1885, we moved to the present site. This is a map for the centenary of European settlement in 1888, and you can see there you go. You can see the building on the present site in 1888. So it moved here in 1885. That, of course, is Vernon's building. That's the original building, which survived here until 1968, 1969, built by Horbury Hunt. It was much derided as the art barn, which is very unfair to a fine architect like Horbury Hunt, because the building he constructed was intended purely as the basement of a much grander building. But it did survive. As you know, in the 1890s there was economic depression and funds just dried up. But the entire collection was on display, and you can see from Pointer's Arrival of the Queen of Sheba, a very much loved work from the collection, and the Defence of Rorke's Drift, also much loved work from the collection. So the International Exhibition was this great opportunity for the Art Gallery of New South Wales in terms of a home, getting its first dedicated space, and then leverage to move to the current site in a much more appropriate building. The other thing it was for the gallery was an opportunity to acquire works from a broader basis than they had previously done. Up until 1879, most purchases were of English, from England, and also from local artists. But the International Exhibition brought together a wide range of work from throughout the world. They purchased work with an Australian connection, such as this Govet's Gorge by Charles Edward Hearn, who was an English artist who settled for a brief period in Sydney. But they also bought a number of British works. Altogether, I think we acquired about 50 works from the International Exhibition, and we were gifted the same after the exhibition, either from the government, the colonial government, who purchased works. Parkes was very active in purchasing from the exhibition, and from some of the nations contributing to the exhibition. Part of the advantage of the exhibition, although there weren't the tariffs on art that became such an important thing in Australia in the 20th century, works were expensive to ship, and so this was a great opportunity. Our trustees' minutes show that quite a lot of money, £5,000, was spent in acquisitions, which was about 3 times the annual award of the government in terms of acquisitions. This is a work by Thomas Cooper, Minster Marshes, from 1877. This work by Healy Hounswell, which depicts Pope Gregory the Great, non angli sed angeli, this thing where the Pope saw Anglo-Saxon slaves in a Roman market and asked who they were, and he was told that they're angles, and he says, you know, non angli sed angeli, not angles but angels, and then was inspired to send Augustine as a missionary to England. So these kind of works, and this for many years was a popular work in the collection. These kind of works were images that supported the narrative of identity and religion for the colonisers. And by far the biggest acquisitions were watercolours and works on paper. This is the Butter Tower by Thomas Dibdin. And these works were very significant because you have people like Lionel Lindsay, the native-born artists of the next generation, Ure Smith, talking about the significance of seeing these works in the collection. The watercolours and the graphic works really had a big impact on our local artists, the next generation of local artists. This was from the Graphic Court, and we made a purchase of about 15 watercolours and prints from the Graphic Court, 2 works here. I particularly love this one because that's how Victorian parents should take their large family out for a walk on a Sunday. But not only British works, which were in some ways familiar. The most interesting thing was the International Exhibition gave the possibility for looking beyond the traditional British connections. And so they were able to buy works by Giovanni Fontana from the Italian court, La Sonnambula, and from the German Imperial Court, a work by Fritz Beinecker, The Jungler in the Village Fair. It's been interesting for me in the light of Jonathan, this wonderful Kaldor project, because it's thrown up new research, or initiated for us here at the gallery new research, because we've been interested to pursue this idea of looking beyond the normal connections. And in many ways, as you saw, Montefiore and Dufour, our early figures, seminal figures in the gallery, were not from the Anglo establishment. Montefiore, a Jew from the West Indies, Dufour from a French background. They were to a certain extent outsiders, and from their lives, from their purchases, from the correspondence, you could see that they did have a slightly broader vision to look beyond. We've been very interested to find any traces of, at the same time, whether they looked within and engaged with Indigenous culture in any way. From our archive, those traces unfortunately haven't been found. And as Michael mentioned, our first acquisitions of Indigenous art were in the 1940s. Shari, who's our archivist of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander collections, has actually found earlier offers of work, and we were offered work before the First World War. So there is this earlier engagement, but unfortunately acquisitions did not occur until the 1940s. And when you read some of the reports around the exhibition, and we're all thankful for Jonathan for making us read these and go back over these periods, in many ways it's not surprising. In the official report at the end of the exhibition on New South Wales, the mention of Indigenous people from New South Wales, it only takes up one paragraph, and they're mentioned in a paragraph that lumps them with the Chinese and the native races. And it says the number of Chinese is estimated at 10,000, many of whom are highly successful as market gardeners. The Indigenous habitants are very few. They have resisted all attempts to win them over to civilization and are rapidly dying out. And that was the official report published in 1880. But perhaps for us, in terms of the other and looking beyond our traditional connections, the most important acquisitions were a series of Meiji ceramics, bronzes and enamels that were eventually the gift of the Imperial Japanese government and that are now split between our collection and the Powerhouse Museum. During lunchtime, if you have some time, come down to the library because we've put some of these works on display. Up until about the 1960s, this part of the collection was a little bit derided. It was often spoken as Meiji trade ceramics. But now as we get further from that period, I think they look more and more interesting. And they're very important because they are the start for us of our non-European collections. And I've just put a few of them up there. I want to end with sex because it's always memorable, and I'm sorry to rush through because I do want you to have lunch. From the saucy French court, of course, they purchased a nude, which is what you have to do from the saucy French court, and they purchased this Charles Landel, the nymph of Diana, which for many, many years, and I'd like to have it put back up on the walls, was one of the favourite works in the collection, and it was hung for about 60 years in the Central Court. And I love to end with this letter to your predecessor, Michael, in 1906, from Mr. Maxwell. I have just on a visit to Sydney recently had the very great pleasure of visiting your beautiful pictures. It did me good to look at them. But the naked pictures of females that hang on the left going on stirred in me feelings that were not easily kept down. That was the strongest temptation I met with in all Sydney. A friend of mine who was with me said that they were a work of art and therefore allowable. Such pictures cannot be thus excused in my estimation. They should not be there. So I think we'll end with the French acquisitions. Thank you.
So I know we're just creeping into lunch, but I thought we'd just call our three speakers up onto stage just to take a couple of questions just before lunch, because I think they've raised a number of really important issues that I think we might be worth examining. So if anyone has a burning question that they thought of while listening to our speakers, or can think of one, please raise your hands. We've got some people with some mics to take questions now. So, and Peter, so then we're all up.